Welcome back to season 3 of This Has to Work. We have a new co-host, new format, and a deeper focus on startups and ecosystem dynamics in Alabama. Get ready to nerd out on episode 1 titled Unlikely Allies, when different paths lead to the same questions. First, let me introduce Kelly Clark. Kelly is the new co-host of This Has to Work, and I couldn't be more excited to get someone smarter and more interesting than me. Welcome, Kelly.
I am here.
You are here. Congratulations.
To take over.
Yeah, step one.
Step one, and steal your data.
There you go.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited that you're here. I'm really excited to get into this with you. You and I have had the opportunity to work together in a bunch of different capacities.
Yeah.
And so when I had this crazy idea to say, I think you were like, hey, I'm really wondering, and Matt's going to have me on to like be on the podcast. And I'm like, I'll do you one better. How about you co-host the podcast with me?
Yeah, I was like, wait, this guy has his podcast. I'm like, well, no longer an office away, but like, look, we have good conversations? Can we do a podcast? And
yeah, and I think that's a good point. I mean, we have these conversations all the time, and I think some of them get pretty introspective. Yeah. And so let's hope that's interesting at least. So talk a little bit about the premise of this podcast, what we're trying to do, why that's, important or relevant or we hope interesting to other people.
Yeah, I think the root of it is we've had good conversations. We've had conversations that have had friction, right? We have differences in opinions. But what I noticed is when we do have these conversations, we have some middle ground, and you don't really find that type of dynamic often with folks. And I certainly wasn't expecting it to like have that dynamic with this Gen X white dude, right?
Love it. Coming out strong.
Just keeping it 100. Yeah. But it exists. And so there's lots of conversations that we have both had. We've had with other colleagues, friends. And I guess the question is, how can we bring some of these conversations to light, right? And have them in a constructive way. And I'm a big believer in clarity gets you to high quality. And the only way you get to clarity is by asking the right questions, right? Or asking those questions that may make you uncomfortable. And so I think the premise of this is to have two people who have differences of opinions, sometimes completely different lived experiences, have a conversation on the topics that we're all talking about. We go into a meeting, then we come out the meetings and we're having like the water cooler conversations and saying, what can we excavate? What can we learn? What have we done well? Where do we still need to grow? What opportunities exist that we're not seeing? And so, that's the premise, just to have some perhaps frictioned conversations, but in a way that is constructive.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is a little bit like a startup, this podcast.
Yeah, we don't know what we're doing.
We have no idea.
Absolutely.
And it's going to change over time. But hopefully what we do is kind of evolve into conversations that, we might be using Alabama and its startup ecosystems as a backdrop. Mm-hmm. But hopefully this content is relevant to other kind of emerging or nascent startup ecosystems throughout the world, but certainly throughout the United States. So hopefully people will engage with us and say, hey, we're seeing something similar, or we had something similar and this is what happened instead, and this is how we course corrected, or whatever the case may be. So I could get kind of really excited about that. So now that we've established what we're attempting to do, let's set up this episode. So talk a little bit about kind of, those two perspectives. We're coming from two different places, certainly have two different, life experiences, I think is the nice way of saying it. Yeah. Definitely a Gen X white guy over here.
You use a lot of baseball analogies. That's kind of like the hallmark.
Really? Do I?
Yeah. Baseball and movies.
Movies. Yeah, for sure. I can hear that in my own commentary. Baseball surprised me though.
Yeah. It's the balls and strikes thing.
Oh, we'll get into balls and strikes. So lay out the premise of this episode. Yeah,
the premise of this episode is to level set. I think it's important to understand how this even happened and like first impressions and the conversations that kind of changed each of our perspectives. So like, this is kind of off topic, but not really. Are you really from the South?
Yeah.
Are you really?
Yeah.
So my first impression, I thought you were from the Northeast.
Okay, so let's dissect this for just a second. I am technically from the South because I'm from Maryland, and Maryland is south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Are you serious?
I am serious.
That is not the South.
It's called geography.
No.
Crack a book.
Maryland.
So Maryland is in Pennsylvania. The state line is also the Mason-Dixon line. So everything south of there was technically Confederate state. Everything north of there was a Union state. And, you know, as my dad likes to put it, I'm channeling my father here, he would say it was a lot more difficult for people in Maryland to be Union or Confederate because they were effectively on the dividing line.
Yeah.
And he's right in that some of the bloodiest, some of the worst skirmishes, battles actually happened right there near the line, whether it was Gettysburg, whether it was Antietam in Maryland, so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I'm technically from the South, but here's what I will say.
What?
Depending on where you are in the country, people will interpret that differently.
True.
So people down here, I might as well be from New York.
Truly.
Right?
You're from New York.
My mother-in-law, who is from Western New York, I might as well be from Alabama when I was born in Maryland. So I think perspective has a lot to do with it.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fair. So you've been in Alabama for how long?
15 years.
15 years in Alabama. I was born and raised in Alabama. Moved away like most folks. And then I came back in 2015. So spent some time in the Midwest. And then I think it was that experience that showed me, one, Alabama is not this unique, anomaly that we believe it to be, or that other people believe it to be, and that we are really a diverse community, a diverse state. For you, what was your wake-up call doing the ecosystem work, and something hit you of, okay, there's some conversations that need to be had? Or what was the moment where it hit you where you were a bit naive? And I'll throw mine out there. A couple of years ago, I was working with an organization where we trained adult learners to make transitions into technology careers, right? And so you have someone who come in who they may have been working in the service industry, maybe working for $5 an hour and some tips. And so they come through our program, then they'll exit our program, junior developer, making upwards $50K and up, right? That's a generational change. We were doing this work, and part of our work was to match them with employers. And we constantly had these issues where we would have someone that was trained that could do the work, who could be a data analyst. Then we put them in front of a stakeholder and it was like, okay, you needed someone who had this expertise. Here you go. And the response would be, they need a bachelor's. It's like, but they can do the work. Like you said, you needed this expertise. They can do the work. They have the expertise, but you need a bachelor's. And the resistance to make that one change, and I get it, those things exist for a reason, but I think I went into doing some of the economic and workforce development work. I was very black and white, and I think that was the moment, at least on the ground, where I realized, okay, we know there are large infrastructure and systemic issues, but there are even these issues within the context of you are solving the problem for the people who have the problem, and you're still running into barriers, and there may or may not be a willingness to make changes to get to the outcome that we're all working towards. And that kind of straightened me up a bit and made me realize, okay, there's some complications in here. There's some things happening that I don't fully understand, and honestly found really frustrating. And so that was kind of my wake-up call, right? That all of this work is super layered, and we can have the best intentions and the best strategy and still run into some barriers that, quite frankly, to me are stupid. Yeah. But from your experience, what was your wake-up call?
I think for me, it was realizing that we have these organizations in town that are focused on entrepreneurship and innovation and startups, and the board is full of bankers and lawyers.
Oh, yeah.
And I was kind of scratching my head and going, well, where are the entrepreneurs? Like, where are the startup people? And then the wake up call was more specific around, when I asked the CEO of that organization at one point, I said, how many of your board members are actively working with startups as like vendors or partnerships or even spending time as mentors? And the answer was 0. And I thought to myself, I think we're in kind of the thoughts and prayers kind of era of startups here, which is we really want these, companies to do well. We want startups to start up here. We want them to grow. We want them to do, but I'm not going to spend any money with them. I'm not going to spend time with them. I'm not going to risk anything personally or professionally to make that happen. And that was, it was a gut check for sure. But I also think it was an opportunity, use the term before that I do love, which is calling balls and strikes, which is that was the first opportunity I had to say, does that make sense to you? That you have a board full of people that aren't entrepreneurs, that don't work with entrepreneurs, that don't want to hire startups, that are afraid of them, that aren't willing to expend any of their political capital or personal capital on that. Doesn't that concern you? And it led to some really good conversations. It's conversations we're still having, right? How much progress have we made on that? I don't know. It's arguable. But at least it allowed us to have that very honest conversation, which was the other thing that's always been difficult here, right? Which is the idea that if you are critical, you're difficult. Right? Or if you're critical in the most constructive way possible, you become a problem for people. And then you're avoided, right? Or you're not included in things, or you're just cast as this, like, well, they're just a provocateur, right? They're trying, it's a hot take or something like that. And it's like, is it really to say you have a board full of people that are supposed to be working towards the advancement of startups and entrepreneurs that don't spend any time with startups or entrepreneurs, that don't spend any money with these folks? Like, I didn't think that was that provocative. It seemed like a kind of obvious thing. So anyway, that was probably the biggest wake-up call.
You pulled on something. You were on a panel for Tech Birmingham. It was the state of the ecosystem. If you missed that, I think there's going to be a live stream. Shameless plug. It was a great conversation. I think we should have that conversation at least once a year, every other year. We should pick a moment in time as a community and really look at where we are. And I think through that conversation, one of the reasons I enjoyed it was just clear the amount of growth that we've had as an ecosystem, not only and not necessarily from the metrics that we have hit or have not hit, but just our resilience for constructive feedback when you have the panel that was on the stage, right? Folks who are doing really important work. And even you all are up there saying, this is what we're doing great. This is where we still have challenges. And it was just a really almost vulnerable conversation. You know what I'm saying? And it was just lots of candor. And it really revealed, okay, there's a lot of maturity that has happened in our ecosystem, both with the initiatives on the ground, but how we see ourselves, and just there's a different confidence that we have. And I've had that experience where you will give a constructive critique and it doesn't land well, and you're thinking, well, hell, I didn't think it was that bad. But then I had to step back and ask myself why historically as a community we've been so apprehensive to critique. And I think the place it comes from is we know who we are, and we know our history, and we know, quite frankly, the cloud that has been kind of placed over us, real or imagined. We know what the national perception is, and quite frankly, the local perception is how we view each other. And I think that lends itself to an overcorrection, right? You kind of place yourself in this position where, okay, no one is protecting our reputation, right? No one is standing as a guardian for Alabama or guardian for Birmingham. And so we have to have people who do that. And sometimes there's a bit of an overcorrection, right? Because we don't think highly of ourselves, who will. And, and so you're not as accepting of critique. And I think that's the place historically where it's come from. But I think now we have some real numbers on the board. And I think that has kind of demonstrated, okay, like we have things that we need to work on, but we have really come far. And that's why I'm also a big proponent of like keeping our eyes on our own paper.
Yeah.
Keeping our eyes on our own paper and benchmarking ourselves against ourselves. I think we've had this conversation. Like I can not stand the comparisons to coastal cities. We're too nuanced of a state.
I mean, it's like comparing mayonnaise to mustard. It is completely different. Has nothing to do with each other.
It's different.
Yeah.
And there's just basic infrastructure issues that come with that as well. And so when I see these statistics, it was one that was floating around. It was, it's harder for women to raise money here compared to other, and we were like number 47 or something like that. And I think the method was looking at companies led by women where their annual recurring revenue is like the median income for the entire state. Well, if the number one state was, I think, Washington, D.C., and their median income is, I think, 70 to 60K, our median income is 30K. Well, hell, of course, like that's, right. You can't compete. But also, let's think about the bottom 10th of that list was like a majority rural states, right? And so there's so much infrastructure missing that impedes on the ability to have a burgeoning ecosystem that has nothing to do with potential. It has nothing to do with a person's intellect or desire to start a business. They're just real infrastructural issues by virtue of geography and what's around. And so that's my rant. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I would agree. I think the one of the things that the Alabama ecosystem has done well over the last 5 years is we've really started to break down some of the silos.
Yeah.
It used to very much feel like individual sandboxes. Everybody had their thing, their organization, their funding, their influence, their stakeholders. And it was like, even though we were all working towards the same goal in a very small entrepreneurial ecosystem, we had all these individual things, all this duplication of effort. And frankly, not all of it was very good. Yeah. Right. It was a lot of lip service, a lot of things like that. We just weren't very good at it. And then we bifurcated it, which is crazy to me. So all that to say, I have enjoyed watching Mobile get more involved with Birmingham, Montgomery getting more involved with Huntsville getting more involved with Tuscaloosa or an Auburn or even the Shoals. All of that matters. And I would say for anybody out there listening that is going through kind of this same transition in a small ecosystem, start there. Yeah. Start with breaking down those barriers because that's an unforced error and super easy to fix. Yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but.
No, I agree. I think there definitely were a lot more silos than there are now. And you have all the organizations talking to each other. I think we had a period where everyone was just heads down and trying to solution, right? And fix the problem in their own way. And I think we've accepted the fact that, winning hyper locally is just going to be difficult for a number of reasons. So the path of least resistance and the path to the most wins is through collaboration across the state. And also my belief, collaboration beyond the borders of Alabama, right? And finding ways to do that are beneficial to us and the work that we're trying to do here. So, yeah, I totally agree. And I think leadership matters too, because you mentioned there was a period where you look at a board, and I remember this is a dark time. I remember this when you would go into a influential organization that was focused on entrepreneurship, and everyone on the board was an attorney or an accountant, or and you definitely need an attorney and an accountant on your board for sure. But it was heavy. And I remember Drew Honeycutt actually pointed this out a while ago. He was like, what I'm excited about.
And Drew, just for the audience, Drew was the CEO of Innovation Depot.
Yeah, he was the CEO of Innovation Depot during the pandemic as well. And he pointed out what he was most excited about was seeing that leadership change, where we'd had some successful exits. We'd had some high growth companies and entrepreneurs. Now they have a bit of room to serve and give back. And so you start to see the boards change. You start to see what voices are in the community change. And so, yeah, I think I've lost the plot.
I think you were fine on point. Here's what I would say about the. I think here's the other thing I would say about the leadership change was, as politically unpopular as it is to talk about diversity and inclusion and equity right now, leadership change included having more female leadership at a number of very important positions, not just from a stature or reputational, but getting the work done.
Yeah.
And in that opportunity or in that diversity, we started to get these perspectives, which is how we kind of opened up this episode, which is those perspectives coming from different places. How is that additive to the overall growth and development and texture of an ecosystem? And I would argue that you can look at some of these changes that haven't even been in place that long, and you can already feel that difference. You can already feel some of that texture and that additive value coming in. So I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah.
I do think it's still important for us to be willing to have those conversations, like the tough conversations we had. It was so interesting. You talked about that panel, and I did sit on that panel. Shameless self promotion there, but one of the things that came out of that was the feedback was consistent, and the feedback was, wow, I haven't seen that kind of candor, that kind of honesty, that kind of straightforward, constructive criticism on a panel like that before. And I was like, started out really happy hearing that, and then got kind of sad.
Why?
Well, because why is that the first time? And how do we make sure it happens again? Because I agree. I mean, I think that's where we grow, right? We don't grow from the things, I don't know. Maybe it's too well worn a cliche, but I don't think we grow as much from our wins as we grow as much from our losses, provided we're willing to honestly look back and say, why did we lose? Why did we mess up? How do we prevent that from happening again?
I have a theory. It's because I think it's the funding landscape is what I think. Because the person writing your check most often is in that audience in some way. It's so intermingled and entwined and, quite frankly, enmeshed that a lot of leaders just don't have the room to be that candid, because the person who is writing their check or submitting their grant is right there. But I think that's what made the conversation interesting, and why the panel mattered is because you have a person who leads an organization that the organization is supporting and funding a number of the good organizations that are leading this good work. And that person is on the panel saying, yeah, we have some work to do. And so it really set the tone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So this feels like a good setup for future episodes.
Yeah.
I think that we can build on this, and yes, we're talking about our immediate startup ecosystem, but hopefully people can see these same patterns, can see these same behaviors and these paths for their own ecosystems. And yeah, this will be a kind of a good, bad, and ugly review, but I want to be honest. I want to call balls and strikes. I want to be constructive. I don't want to sit there and just be hot take after hot take. That's not the point. The point is what are we doing right? Let's do more of that. Where did we mess up? How do we avoid that in the future? And I think that's how we progress forward. So until then, thanks for checking out the episode. We'll see you next time. Kelly, so happy to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'm looking forward to our next episode.
Looking forward.